Hello and welcome to this short course, which is designed for parents and carers primarily, though it will be of interest to any adult who is supporting a child or young person. We're thinking about self-esteem in teenagers and perhaps in our pre-teens as well, and we'll be thinking about belonging and creating that sense of purpose and the things that we can do as the adults in a child's life to help them. You might want to do this course on your own. You might want to do it with a co-parent or other adult who is supporting a child, or in fact you might choose to do this course or parts of it alongside the child that you have in mind. It's not designed as a guidebook and full of things that tell you what to do, but rather really, I hope, as a kind of starting point and a springboard for discussion and some ideas that you might begin to explore. I hope that it will get you thinking. I hope that you'll feel able to do and try some of the things that we talk about during this course, but remember that everyone is different and things change. So pick up and run with what feels good for you, and the things that don't feel like a good fit, just leave them for now. It might be worth revisiting this at a later state because things do change. Good luck. I really hope you enjoy it. When thinking about how to parent and care for children and young people, I constantly come back to this idea of adults as role models to children. So we spend a lot of time thinking about what do we want to teach them, what do we want to tell them, but we need to think also about what we want to show them through the way that we talk to ourselves and we interact with the world. Being a role model is a really big responsibility, but it's not one that we can ever walk away from. Our children are always watching and observing and seeing what we do and how we behave and how we talk to ourselves. And so, particularly when it comes to things like self-esteem and body image, we are really important role models to our children. So the first thing we need to think about is, what kind of role model are we right now? Are we proud of the role models that we are? Would we like our children's self-esteem to be based on what they're seeing in terms of our own self-esteem? And are there maybe some things here that perhaps need to be addressed or changed? To help us understand the importance of role models and to kind of give this a bit of context, it can really help to stop and look back at your own childhood and think about who the role models were in your life. There will have been some role models who were really positive, who you learnt behaviours and habits and ways of doing things from, which have had a really positive and lasting impact on the way that you think, behave and do. On the other hand, there will be some more negative role models who perhaps you can see perhaps sowed some seeds of things in yourself that you now feel less comfortable with, who perhaps showed and taught you a way of doing things which you wouldn't want to be passing on to the children in your care. Stopping and just reflecting on that and being honest about who our role models were and what kind of role model we might be compared to those role models that we had can help us to think, who would we like to be in the eyes of our children? One thing to remember here is that we can't change overnight who we are and how we feel and what we think and what we do. But we can consider really carefully what we would like our children to see. So the most easy example for me to use here would be around body image. So as someone with a history of eating disorders, body image is something that I, like many of the population, have really struggled with historically. But I made a commitment to myself that when it came to food and body image, I wanted to be a really positive role model for my children. And that meant actually thinking about what they saw rather than how I felt and what came naturally to me. So I would never, in front of my own children, openly, critically praise my own body and be really negative about it, no matter what I might be doing inside my head. What I would like them to do is to see our bodies as things that are strong and amazing and which can learn and adapt and do different things. I would want them to understand the mechanics of our biology and the physiology and appreciate that we're all different and that that's okay. What I wouldn't want is for them to have very negative self-talk about being too fat or too thin or too short or too tall or any of those other things that many of us have as hang-ups. And I, like many others, have those hang-ups about myself, but I don't want to pass those on to my children. So I guess what I'm saying here is that It's okay to think some things, and we can't change that overnight, though with time and practice things can begin to change. But what we can do is change what our children are seeing. So we can think about, what did we want to outwardly project? What would we like our children to see? Remembering always that children are great imitators, so let's give them something really good, really positive to copy. A really simple place to start here can be things like looking at how we talk about our own achievements and pride in ourselves, and building in some simple daily or weekly routines and habits around that. So we might, for example, instead of doing the socially acceptable thing of downplaying all of our achievements and batting away compliments as they come into us, we might practice the gracious receiving of praise, and we might occasionally take the chance to just look back on the last day or the last week and talk about the things that we've done of which we're really proud. We can do this with our children, and we can be quite specific in our praise of self and role model this pride in oneself when you've tried really hard, or you've achieved something new, or you've overcome a fear or a worry to do something. Actually name that and talk about it and share it with your child, because this is exactly what we would hope our children to be and to do. This is something I talk about with teachers a lot. I talk with them about, what kind of learners would you like in your classroom? And often the answer is that we want learners who are bold and brave, who are willing to try new things, who are confident at trying to solve problems, and who pick themselves up and try again if they don't succeed in their first attempt in learning. And actually, as parents, as carers, we're looking for those same kind of attributes in our children and young people. So just thinking about how we talk about our own successes, how we take pride when we've tried hard, and how we reflect on those moments when things went less well. These are all really good moments for role modelling and opportunities for helping to pass to the next generation some really good, positive, healthy habits. With all that in mind, it can help just to take a moment to stop and to think, what are the things that you role model well right now? In what ways are you a good, positive role model to the children in your care? And then, as well, we're always looking to learn and to build. Where are the areas where perhaps you're less confident, where perhaps you wouldn't really want your child to be copying the way that you do things, or the way that you think, or the way that you behave? Whilst recognising those strengths and those challenges won't enable us to change how we do things overnight, it can help us to recognise where perhaps we feel that there is some room for improvement, or where we might need to kind of fake it till we make it. Remembering that it's really important that we try to convey the things that we want our children to see. You can also look a little bit more widely and consider within your child's life, what other role models are there? It might be that you feel that there are some areas that you're not able to be the role model that you would like your child to see, or simply that there are some other adults in your child's life who you think are really brilliant role models and you would like your child to aspire to be more like them. Thinking about who these people might be and exploring that with your child, thinking about who their role models are in their life, can be a really nice, interesting exercise to do with a child, and can help us to kind of identify those brilliant adults who often surround us. When we're thinking about who our child's role models could and should be, sometimes the temptation is to think big and think of kind of people who have sort of celebrity and are kind of heroes, but actually the everyday heroes are the ones who'll make a difference here. The people who are actually actively involved in your child's life, who feel a little bit like them, who've walked a similar path, who they can see a little bit of themselves in. These are people who are realistic role models for our children. And also, role models don't have to be perfect. I often think about the idea of being human rather than being a hero, and these are role models to which we can genuinely aspire. When we pitch ourselves up here and we're looking at role models who are perhaps the story that someone is telling rather than the actual reality of someone we know in real life, then this can feel very unachievable. But our everyday heroes, those humans around us who are living normal, everyday lives, a little bit similar to our own, but perhaps a little bit further down the path, these are people who give us things that we can try to live up to, and habits that we can copy, and ways of thinking and doing that we can try to imitate. This next module is an exercise which, as a parent, as a carer, as an adult involved in a child's life, is really lovely to do. And make sure that you do this one, even if you don't do anything else in the course. This module I love. So we're thinking now about what makes your child brilliant. No doubt, if you've come here with a child in mind, there'll be things about them that you love. There'll be things about them that drive you a little bit, but now we're thinking about the good bits. And when we have a child in our lives, then undoubtedly there are things about them that we think are just fantastic. Our love often runs really deep, and we could often write the longest list in the world of all the things about them that we love. Now, my first question to you is, when was the last time that you told your child this? Do they know all these things about them that you think are brilliant? How do you know that they know? And I say this because quite often this depth of love, this admiration for our child and the wonderful human being that they're becoming is something that's just such a part of our everyday, just such a part of our unconscious being that we don't often think to say it out loud or to show this and demonstrate it to our child, to write it down, to celebrate it with them. And you will sometimes find when you begin to explore this with a child, when you tell them what you think is wonderful about them, that it's a bit of a surprise to them. You have to remember that children, the only experience they have of being is of being themselves. And so they won't necessarily realise that their quirks and their eccentricities and the things about them that you think are really rather brilliant are anything different to anything anyone else has. And of course, actually, this is true for all of us. And if your child's up for it, thinking together about this as a two-way exercise can be really nice, because sometimes you'll find that the things that your child admires about you and appreciates about you are things that might surprise you as well, because your only experience of being is of being yourself. Ditto, you might look at this as a family and look between the adults in the family or the different children amongst each other. What are the things that we admire about each other? What makes each of us brilliant, and why do we love each other? This can be a slightly kind of strange exercise at first if you're not a family who's used to vocalising these things, but it's really lovely, and hearing from those that you love most the things that they love about you is really affirming and can sometimes have the effect of helping us to notice and realise things about ourselves that we didn't realise to be true. And this is really true for children when they're in those formative years, as they're going through those pre-teen and teenage years, when they're really beginning to find themselves and find that sense of self-identity. Hearing from the adults around them and perhaps the other children in the family the things about themselves that other people think are great can really help them to lock into that sense of identity, to really identify with those characteristics, those attributes about themselves, and really lean into those things and become more them, if these are things that they do somewhat identify with. So for example, if I was talking about my own children, one of them, I would tell you, Ellie, she is the most imaginative child that you've ever come across. She is quite kooky. She often voices the thoughts of our dog, Alfie, which is unusual to say the least. It's got to the point where when Alfie and Ellie are in the room and Alfie is speaking, we just assume it's actually Alfie's thoughts, which now I reflect on it, that's a little odd. But this is Ellie, and she lives in her own little world, and she is so remarkably imaginative and always has different things going on. And that's one of the things that I really especially love and admire about her, is her imagination and how free her spirit is. And one of my key aims as an adult in her life is to try and make sure that this never gets stamped out of her. On the other hand, my other daughter, Lyra, she is very different than her sister, and one of the things I would say that I really love about her is how kind and thoughtful and what a deep thinker she is. So she thinks about things from many different points of view, and she puts a lot of thought and care and attention into all the things that she does. She's much more practical than her sister, so they're very different, but I love that about her. I love that when we have a new project, she's there right away thinking about lists and labelling it and making it work and planning it out. She doesn't have the same kind of strangeness about her perhaps that her sister does, but she's very good at making things happen. So they're really different, and I love that, and it's really nice to be able to explore that, and also lovely when I hear them talk to each other about the things they admire about one another. I just have to say, as a little caveat here, I sometimes feel when I'm teaching these courses that perhaps you think our lives are a little bit Enid Blyton. We have our moments too. My children also sometimes hate each other, and sometimes I have moments when parenting is a thing I wonder why I entered into it. We all have these moments, but we're thinking about the positives. So remember, we all have our ups and downs, and in this moment, this module, we're thinking about what makes our child brilliant. This also can be a really, really helpful thing if that relationship between you and your child has become strained and there might be some tension there, and it might be a little bit harder right now for you to think about what makes your child brilliant. Perhaps they've really lost a bit of their sense of self, or perhaps their behaviour has been a little bit distressing or challenging to you lately, and it's much easier for you to list the things that are difficult right now than the things that you admire and respect about them. If that's the case, this exercise is actually even more important. And sometimes we have to hunt really hard or cast our memory back a little bit to a slightly different time with our child to find those things and connect with them. But when we do this, then it can help us to remember what we most love about our child, and it can help those characteristics, those parts of them, to begin to really shine through. A couple of practical things here in terms of this admiration of our child, of each other, and celebrating what's brilliant. One is to remember that physical tokens will always be treasured by a child and remembered more than simply words. So if there's something that you'd like to celebrate about your child, why not write it down? It might be something as simple as a text message, or perhaps you'll write something physical that they can keep. Something that they can see and reflect on can be really helpful. Our words, what we say verbally, tends to just get lost, particularly if a child's got quite a negative self-narrative going on, because they might kind of tune it out, whereas something physical, a tangible reminder, is much harder to dismiss. The other thing is just building in a regular practice of paying meaningful compliments. So meaningful compliments, as far as I'm concerned, they're spontaneous. We see something good and we praise it. They're specific. We tell a child exactly what it is that we like about what they have done. And they're sincere. We really, really mean them. So spontaneous, specific, and sincere. Those for me are the elements of a great compliment. And the next bit, and remembering about our role modelling here, learning to accept those compliments graciously. And I've talked about this in other courses, so I won't go on too much about it, but just notice. Are you role modelling the gracious acceptance of compliments? People give compliments as a gift. They enjoy giving them. Don't throw them back in their faces. Learn to take them, accept them, and ride with them. Next, we're going to think about multiple pillars of self-esteem and why this is really important. So, the basic premise here is one I return to often in my teaching, and this is the idea that a good temple, and I've built a lot of temples, I haven't built any temples, a good temple is held up by multiple pillars. And that is because if you put a pillar on one temple, it is kind of wobbly. And if anything happens to that one pillar, the whole thing's going to come crumbling to the ground, and that is not a good thing. So instead we have multiple pillars holding up our temples. Our self-esteem is just the same. So our self-esteem is made up of the things that we enjoy and value about ourselves, the things that if someone told us to describe ourselves that we would list. So I might say to you, hello, I'm Pookie. I am a mum and a wife, and I work in mental health, and I climb and I sing and I knit. And I can list now a lot of things that make up my self-esteem. There's lots of different parts of the recipe of me. It hasn't always been this way, and that was a problem, and this can be a problem for our children too, because sometimes our self-esteem is so balanced on just one thing, one element, that it's really, really risky if anything goes wrong. So where I have seen this happen in the past, I've done work with football academies, and the children there often train really hard in football. They eat, they sleep, they drink football, and then they get injured, or they don't make it through to the next stage as they get older. And suddenly this one pillar that they had of their self-esteem, football, is gone, and there's nothing. There's nothing left and they fall apart. And this is something we see quite a bit. It can happen as well with children who perhaps are highly focused just on their academics. So you might find that your child becomes focused, really focused on their academic performance if they're in an exam year, and everything is poured into their schoolwork and achieving highly there, and everything else drops off. They stop doing the sports, they stop hanging out with their friends, they stop with the hobbies, and everything is pinned on the academics. And what if they don't get the grades that they need? Or if something goes wrong? Or what if, like during the pandemic, suddenly those exams don't happen? Everything crumbles. For other kids, it might be a particular hobby, it might be their looks. So we find this sometimes where a child is very, very focused on how they look and to the exclusion of all else. There's lots of different things that might be the single pillar. And the key thing is actually we just need more than one pillar. So this is particularly important if you have a child who's got a really deep special interest in something and their whole life revolves around this one thing. It's where their friendships are, it's how they spend their free time, it's the thing they want to always be doing. And that's great. And there's a lot of power there. And there's something really wonderful about really knowing the thing that we love and really digging deep there and really connecting with others over it. But we just need to ask ourselves the question every now and then, what would happen if that pillar got knocked down? Is there anything else holding this temple up? Because there can be worst case scenarios. What if your child is very involved with a specific activity and this is what they enjoy doing more than anything in the world? What if for some reason they weren't able to engage in that activity anymore, or they fell out with the people that they normally do it with and so they can't do it? Or there's loads of different reasons why this pillar might crumble, and you know, the pandemic certainly has made us think much more carefully about this. So think about the different things that make your child them, and just wonder with them, are there enough of these things? Do we need to broaden our horizons a little bit? A key thing as a parent and carer here is making sure that those interests don't shrink too much when your child becomes hyper-focused, particularly on things like exams. So when they're really focused in on the academics, I would always be encouraging a child to continue with their friendships, to continue with the sports and the hobbies that they might have enjoyed previously. Sure, they might tone them down a bit because perhaps they don't have enough hours in the day to do all the things to all the levels that they want to. But for example, if your child was a really keen hockey player, perhaps they're not going to do it at team level anymore, but maybe they can do it just socially for fun. So they've still got that pillar going in their self-esteem. A final thing to point out here, I think is really important, is that our self-esteem, that temple, is not only made up of pillars of things that we're good at, it's made up of things that we enjoy and we value about ourselves. So doing something just because we love it and we identify with it and we feel part of that community perhaps is a good enough reason. So the example for myself here would be singing. I love to sing. I sing as a tenor in my local choir, and that's a really important part of my self-identity and something that I've hugely missed over the pandemic. It's really important to me, even though actually I'm not necessarily very capable. It doesn't matter. It's an important part of who I am, and it's an extra pillar in that temple of self-esteem. Have a think about, what are the pillars that make up your self-esteem? Are there lots of them? And if not, how could there be more? As a parent, what can sometimes happen here is that the single pillar of our self-esteem becomes being a mum or being a dad or being a carer, because that's very, very all-consuming. And if that's the case for you, just stopping and thinking about, what are the things that I used to enjoy before I was a parent and carer, and can I reconnect with some of those people or some of those activities, because we need more than just this. Particularly as our children are getting a little bit older and becoming more independent, what happens to us when they begin to go out and find their own way in the world and they don't need so much of us anymore? Sometimes for parents and carers, this is when things for them begin to really fall apart. So having multiple pillars of our self-esteem matters too. And as always, it means that we're being a great role model to our child as well. Perhaps alongside your child, you could develop a new pillar together. Maybe there's an activity that you could take up alongside one another and really enjoy, and that could be an additional pillar for both of you. Next, I'm going to share with you a concept called ikigai, which is probably a complete mispronunciation. It's a Japanese concept and it's about your reason for being. And I just love this really simple framework as a way of helping us to find our purpose in life. And you might find that this is something that you can talk to your teen about and maybe explore for yourself as well, to find that sense of purpose, that drive, and try to find where in this thing called life might I fit. Now, I find this concept really helpful to explore with teens and young people as they're beginning to grapple with that concept of self-identity and think about what their purpose in life might be and how they can make their ding in the universe. We often find that our preteens and our teens, particularly this generation coming up through now, really want to connect with a feeling of belonging and purpose, and that can be challenging. So Ikigai gives a really simple framework for doing that. I'll put it on the screen now so that you can have a look, and I'll just talk you through the different elements. So the first thing we think about is, what do we love? What is our passion? What are the things that we really enjoy doing? And you can help your teen to find this, or you can find it for yourself by thinking, if you could do absolutely anything for a day, what's the thing that you would choose to do above all else? Next, you think about, what are you good at? What are your skills? And we need to remember with our teens that actually it's possible to become good at almost anything that we choose. And we need to think about that idea of growth mindset and the idea that perhaps we can't yet, but we can learn to. But by the time that they're getting to the preteen and the teen years, many children and young people will have quite a keen sense of their particular skills and strengths. And so they might want to lean into those and really make use of those attributes. So recognizing what they're really good at. And if they can't see those things in themselves, again, as an adult, you can help to identify those things and appreciate the gifts and the talents that you believe that they have. Next, we think about what the world needs. And this is about finding our mission, really, and thinking about how we can make a bit of a difference in the world. So what are the ways in which we can apply our skills, our talents, our abilities in a way that is actually helpful to the world, that will help us to identify our mission. And finally, from a very practical point of view, we can think about what are the things that we might actually get paid to do. So what's our vocation? And this might not feel so relevant for your teen, but actually beginning to have these conversations and thinking about how can they use their passions, the things that they love, the things that they feel that they're good at, and the things that the world needs in order to actually create a living for themselves later on, can be really good things to start thinking about from very early on, and can really help them to kind of fine-tune their thinking and perhaps identify some different routes that they might consider taking in their life. So there are different ways that this intersects that can result in a slightly less optimal life, but what we're looking for is where all four of these things, the things that we really love and the things the world needs, what we can be paid to do and what we're really good at, where those things all intersect. The idea is that this is your ikigai, and you may feel that you found yours. You may feel that you haven't, but I just find this framework is one that really starts some very, very interesting conversations and can just a great way to explore things with your teens. So yeah, I just recommend exploring it with them, looking at it with them, and trying to identify some of those things with them and for them, and exploring it in the context of yourself as well. Next, we're thinking about the curse of perfectionism. And I really do think of perfectionism as a curse, and it's one of those things that seems to be all pervasive right now. Everywhere we look, we see the curated stories of other people's lives that are airbrushed, and everyone is their own brand these days, and it just feels like the world around us is perfect, and here we are struggling to just cope and manage. And this is something that really impacts on our self-esteem and the self-esteem of the children and young people in our lives. And so I just want us to just stop and really think about perfectionism and unrelenting standards, and when good enough is good enough. Of course, it's great to aim high and to have good high standards, and sometimes this will really help us to achieve and thrive. But there have to be limits to this as well, and we need to recognise in which parts of our life it's important to reach these very high levels, and when we need to be giving ourselves a bit of a break as well. A helpful starting point here can just be to think about, what is the mood music in your house? Are you a perfectionist household, or are you a household where good enough is good enough? I personally feel it's quite important that we support our children to understand that good enough is good enough, because it helps us to move on all the time, to be trying new things and being brave and bold in our learning, to forgive ourselves when we don't get things exactly right first time, and also to be more productive, because we can spend endless hours trying to reach a state of perfection, and sometimes it feels like we'll never ever get there. And so learning to do a good enough job and then to move on is actually a really important life skill, in my humble opinion. Having conversations with your teen about perfectionism and when is good enough can be really instructive and helpful, because one of the things I often find is a real disconnect between a parent or carer's aspirations for a child and what the child perceives as the parent and carer's aspirations for them. So I will often find, for example, that when it comes to things like mock exam time, children will often be really disappointed in their performance. Parents and carers usually tell me, I just want them to do their best and to feel proud of what they've done. And their teachers often say to me, they did about as well as I expected. These are mock exams, there's still quite a long time to the real thing and we're still practicing. But the children will often be really disappointed in their performance. They feel they should and could have done better and that they've let everyone down. Where this can go wrong is when we don't communicate about this, when our child thinks that we're holding them to these same standards that they're holding themselves to, and when we don't question and challenge those standards which are perhaps unrealistic that they've set for themselves. So open, honest discussion about good enough being good enough, perfectionism, and how high we should be setting those standards, and how forgiving we should be of ourselves if we do not get things right first time. These are where we can have really interesting discussions about learning from failure, about trying new things, and about being kind to ourselves if we're finding things difficult. Another exercise that can help here is to encourage your child to look at themselves and their actions and their deeds through the eyes of someone else. So often they will be highly critical of themselves and have this very perfectionist attitude and think that they're not doing well enough. But if we ask them, what would your best friend say about that? Or what do you think a parent would say about that? What do you think your teacher would say about that? Then they can begin to see that actually others might view them a little bit differently. Or we might ask them, what would you think if a friend was feeling this way, or if a friend did this, how would you respond? And you can use real examples as well. How did you feel when your best friend got a B in their biology mock exam? Were you as unkind about them as you're being about yourself right now? And just questioning that and really beginning to be curious and pick it apart a little bit can be super helpful. And also just going there and asking the question, why does it matter? And there's not necessarily good and easy answers here, but beginning to really explore this. Do the perceptions of others matter? Why do we need always to be striving for this perfection? What's our purpose here? How does it make us feel, and what might feel better? I've touched on this a little bit in previous modules, but I really wanted to drill down on the idea of learning to fail and how important this is for building strong children who have a real sense of purpose and self-identity, and whose self-esteem is good and healthy and positive. We can be role models here, as with all of the other things, in teaching our children how to manage life's knockbacks and how to pick ourselves up when we fall. I think really strongly that learning to fail and learning to bounce back from failure is a hugely important thing, because what we find is that otherwise these kind of perfectionist tendencies and our inability to manage failure can mean that we never ever step outside of our comfort zone, and that makes our world very small indeed. I think it's when we step outside the comfort zone that the magic really begins to happen, and we can only do that if we're unafraid of sometimes getting things wrong. So we need to think about how we can encourage that in our children, and that's partly about role modelling, that's partly about owning up to the things that we've got wrong and teaching our children how we learn from our mistakes, perhaps injecting a bit of humour and looking back on the things that we didn't get quite right and laughing at that and learning from that out loud. And it's also about helping our children to be quite resilient and to persevere and to praise that when we see it happening. And then there's something here about thinking about how we can reframe failure. So what happens instead of using the word failure, we use the idea first attempt in learning. See what we did there? So it's not that we failed, it's just that we haven't learned how to do it yet. Or perhaps we can reframe failure as a learning moment. So there's that old adage that we are going to learn more from our mistakes than from the things that we get right. And I really, really do think that is true, but only if we appreciate those learning moments for what they are. When we get things wrong and we take the opportunity to stop and be curious about, okay, what just happened there? What could I do differently next time? What was it that I did or that happened in this situation that meant that that didn't go quite to plan? Then this is when we can begin to really, really learn. So thinking a little bit here, reflecting on ourselves, just stop and think about, how do you manage challenge and failure in your own life? Are you role modelling that in a way that you would hope for your child to copy? Would you feel comfortable with them responding to failure and challenge in their lives in the same way that you respond to it in yours? And also, as an adult, how do you respond to challenge and failure in your child's life? Do we berate them and reprimand them for getting things wrong? Or do we stand as the guide by their side and think with them and help them to problem solve and think, what could be done differently next time? Or provide an environment where they can ask for support and help in order to have another go, to do things a bit differently next time, to learn from this time when it didn't go quite to plan. We can think about creating safe spaces in which to celebrate failure. There's a really brilliant podcast that I love to listen to by a lady called Elizabeth Day called How to Fail. And she speaks to a different person in each episode and she talks about their biggest failures. And it's really wonderful because she talks to all these wonderful people who've done amazing things, and we normally think of them because of their achievements and their accolades, and instead we see them through the lens of their failures. Just as a slight note here, she's also written a book which is based, I think, largely on the podcast. I don't know, I didn't get very far through the book because I was listening to it, and it started off by how brilliant she was and how successful the podcast had been, and I've been so used to listening to her through the lens of celebrating failure that I found it really jarred with me hearing all her achievements. But that's by the by. Elizabeth Day and her podcast is a really nice example of celebrating failure, and you could do this on a smaller scale in your house. Could you have a fail of the day? Can you look back and laugh at the things that didn't go so well? Could you look at those learning moments and think, what have I learnt this week from things I didn't get right? Remembering always we learn so much more from those moments when we step outside our comfort zone and we try something and we haven't quite managed to get it right yet. I love to climb, and for me, I always talk about, if I'm not falling, then I'm not learning. And this is because when you're climbing, if you're managing every time to complete a route and get to the top each time, you're not pushing yourself hard enough. And then that's okay, as long as I never want to become a better climber. But when I'm trying a problem and I can't do it, and I'm falling and I'm falling and I'm falling, A, the sense of achievement when I get a little bit further or I get to the top of the wall is just brilliant. But B, each time I try again, I'm thinking about it differently. I am either developing my skill or I'm tackling this problem in a slightly different way, and I'm learning with each attempt. And actually, I think this is a really brilliant analogy for life. When we try things and we don't get it right, first time, second time, third time, fourth time even, actually each time, as long as we take it as a learning moment and we stop and we reflect and we try to learn from that and we try to do something a little bit different the next time, then we're learning. And this is all really brilliant stuff for us in life. We learn very little from staying within our comfort zone and continually doing the things that we already can do. A really simple example for this for me is with my children. They get spelling tests at school each week, and if when they do their pre-test they're able to answer all of the spellings and they feel delighted by that, then I think these spellings aren't hard enough. This is not going to add to your vocabulary at all. If you already know these words and you can spell them, we need some stuff that you really can't spell in order to make this actually have some value for you. And that's a really simple example, but it's something you can extrapolate out to life generally. If your child is able to do with ease, well, all the things that they're presented with each day within their hobbies or their academic endeavours, then actually, is it not perhaps time that they pushed a little bit outside that comfort zone? It's when we find that we can't do things, when we don't get them right first time, that we know that that magic is beginning to happen and we're learning and growing. Finally, when it comes to supporting failure and supporting our children to be bold, brave learners, we need to think about our role as the adult. Our role as the adult is not to always pick them up and fix it and tell them what to do, but rather to be there with a hand extended should they wish to take that offer of support, to brainstorm ideas out with them and perhaps problem solve with them a little bit if they want ideas about how to do things differently. And most of all, just to keep on unconditionally loving them, whether they succeed or whether they fail with each attempt. A really important thing that we can facilitate as an adult in a child's life is helping a child to find their tribe. Now, what I mean by that is helping a child to find the people with whom they feel they fit. And this can be difficult, and life is so much better once we found those people. You likely have your own tribes. Maybe these are the people that you work with. Maybe they are people that you enjoy a particular activity with. Perhaps it's the people that you met in your NCT class. For some reason, those tribes seem to be very, very strong. But whoever it might be, there will be people, and perhaps there's more than one tribe that you feel that you belong with, where you feel like you really fit. And that feels good. You get that sense of belonging, that sense of identity, a sense of being amongst people who get you and understand and like you. And that's really wonderful. Children, when they're younger, may not yet have found their tribe. And as adults, we can try to help them find them. Places where we might start looking to find a child's tribe are often looking at those pillars of self-esteem. So those things about themselves that children really enjoy and value, these can often be places where we will find other people who are a bit like us. Where we share an interest, a skill or a passion with somebody else, then often we'll find that these are someone with whom we can connect on some level. We have something in common here, something that binds us together. These people can often become one of our tribes. And remember, when we're thinking with our child about who their tribe might be and who might be the people with whom they might connect, it's important that they understand that we don't have to be like each other to like each other. So sometimes opposites attract, and some of the best tribes are made up of all sorts of different kinds of people. So whilst we might be sometimes attracted towards people who are just like us, actually finding people where there's something in common, so we have something to talk about, to share, to connect us, but who have many other things that are different to us, this adds to the rich tapestry of life and can help us to understand and appreciate our unique skills and talents and attributes because we're a bit different than the other people who are around us. Sometimes the thing that brings us together is purely one of proximity. So some of the tribes that your children might belong to might simply be people who they have been in a class with at school. And we find that proximity is actually a really great way of generating some really quite diverse tribes. So I went to university with a group of people who were very different than me. We've all travelled very different ways in life, but some of my closest friends in adulthood are people whose surnames were next to mine in the alphabet. So in the rooms near to me and friends who I maintain to this day, I have a friend Anna who has become a stand-up comedian, who is a wonderful, hilarious musician, and who is also training to be a sommelier. I have my friend Rachel, who is another comedian actually. She's quite famous stand-up. You'll see her on the telly and stuff these days. I have a friend Izzy, who is a very intelligent barrister and she does all sorts of stuff around intellectual property, which I find interesting because when I met her, she told me she wanted to be either an astronaut or an opera singer. She's not done either of those things. She's a barrister, but she's a very, very good one. And then my friend Carol, who is a school business manager. We're very different. There's not a lot necessarily that binds us together. Other than that, our names were next to each other in the alphabet, and we liked each other. It's a really diverse tribe, and it's a tribe I really love being part of. So help your child to find who their tribes might be, and remember, we don't have to be like each other to like each other. When it comes to helping build those tribes, think about your role as the adult of facilitating this. So actually creating opportunities for children to invest time being together. That might be online, or it might be that you're facilitating time spent together, particularly time spent together in leisure time outside of school and structured activities can be times when these connections really deepen and strengthen. So this is sometimes as simple as providing the environment in which children might be together without lots and lots of adult intervention, but perhaps with the occasional bit of care, kindness and food. That's sometimes all that we really need to do here, is create the space and provide the food, of course. If your child is struggling to find their tribe, then a really great place to look can be online. So some children will find that they haven't really found the people with whom they gel and fit in their offline life. But the great thing about the world now is it's really small, and we will always be able to find people who are like us if we look online. There will be other people in the world with whom we've got some shared interests or ethos. So helping your child to safely explore the online world and find other people who might be facing similar challenges or have similar passions to themselves can be really helpful. I found this to be particularly valuable for children who might feel a little bit different within their community, particularly if it's a small, close-knit community where there might not be other people who might have the same life experience as them. So for example, children in rural communities who might be lesbian or gay or transgender, for example, will sometimes find it's easier to connect with other people with a similar life experience through the joy of the online world. Finally, it's important to recognise that sometimes your child will fall in with a tribe who you do not consider to be positive. Maybe you think this is a negative influence on your child's life and you would really rather they were not part of this tribe. That's okay, but we need to explore this really carefully with our child and be sensitive to the fact that actually feeling that sense of belonging, that sense of being around people who we like and who like us and who value us, is something that's incredibly important to our self-esteem. And so if we put down our foot really hard and fast and say, no, you must not be with those people anymore, this can really rock a child's sense of self-identity and can really tear apart those bonds that you might have spent many, many years building with them. So think with your child about what it is that they enjoy about being with these people. And if you really don't feel that there's a way to make this work positively, then we need to think about how can they find this sense of belonging, this sense of purpose and being with another tribe. How can we facilitate that and support it? Finally, we're going to think about the idea of aiming really low in order to fly very high. And this is an idea that I return to often, and it's because it really works. So we will often have great hopes and aspirations for our child, but it can feel a little bit daunting for them to try to live up to these expectations or to live up to their expectations of themselves. And these futures that we imagine, that they imagine, can feel so far off that it's impossible to know how to start. So instead, what we need to do is break this right down and think about what is the next step towards perhaps that eventual goal. So we just need to take tiny, tiny, tiny steps. And particularly if your child is one who does struggle with their self-esteem and who perhaps is facing particular challenges in their life right now, they might be overwhelmed with the things that they feel that they cannot do. And so what we need to do is to build a really positive cycle of reinforcement, helping them to realise what they can do. So breaking down big, far off seeming goals into very, very, very tiny, manageable steps that are so small that they feel ridiculous. Well, of course I can do that. Then let's do it. Let's achieve it. Let's mark that one off as something that we can do, and then let's think about what next. And you might make these tiny steps very, very, very quickly, and before you know it, actually you've progressed quite far. So breaking big, far off goals down into tiny, tiny, tiny steps can be really helpful. One of the things that I have found really struck home with me recently was listening to the American astronaut Chris Hadfield. In fact, he's a Canadian astronaut, which is kind of the point. He wanted to become an astronaut. There was no space program in Canada at the time, and he didn't know how to make this happen. And as a 9-year-old, he decided, I'm going to just always do what an astronaut would do. So when I'm choosing what to eat for breakfast, I will eat what an astronaut would eat. So he had this far off goal in mind, but basically he broke it down into really, really, really tiny decisions that he made all day, every day, in order to help him to achieve that goal. And I think breaking things down makes it much, much more manageable. And the other thing is that when we break big goals down into lots of tiny little pieces, then it's much harder for those to be taken away from us. When we're aiming up here and our whole focus is there, if we don't get there, then it feels like we've failed and we've achieved nothing. If instead we've broken it into lots and lots and lots of tiny, tiny, tiny little pieces, then we have all these pieces. And even if we never quite make it to this far off goal, we've still got all these other pieces of the puzzle. These are all bits that increase our sense of our self-identity, our self-esteem, our sense of self-worth, and no one can take them away. And if they do, perhaps, you know, something that we could do, we can't do anymore, but we've still got all these others. And if you've got a child who's really struggling, actually keeping a note of these, writing them down. I recently interviewed someone on my podcast who would talk about the cookie jar, and he would fill the cookie jar up with the things that the child could do. So he'd write them down on a post-it note and add them to the jar so the child could see, these are all the things I can do. And these things might be really tiny. I held my pencil today for a child who is struggling with school attendance. We write it down, we celebrate it, we put it in the cookie jar. Keep a note of the things that we can do. Make those steps really tiny. And when in doubt, just ask yourself, what is the next right thing to do? That's from Frozen, I think. So in Frozen, again, it's Frozen 2. There's, you know, the big thing that needs to happen and it feels too big and too scary. And so Anna and Elsa find themselves thinking, what is the next right thing? We only ever have to do the next right thing. We don't need to worry about this goal so much. Just what's the next step? That's all we need to know. Okay, that was a whole lot of information in there. I hope that some of those ideas landed with you, that you could imagine using one or two of them with the child or young people in your care. Maybe some of it was food for thought for yourself, because this is partly about you helping your child, but it's also partly going right back to that first module about thinking how you can be the best role model that your child really, really needs to see. You don't have to make all these changes as big changes, just like we talked in the last module. Just think about what's the next right thing. What is something that you feel that you could do that would begin to make a difference? I really hope you enjoy trying some of these ideas, explore some of them with your child, and remember that it's okay not to like them all. And you can bond with that with your child as well. Sometimes bonding over the things that seem ridiculous can be incredibly helpful and can provide us with some of our kind of shared sense of being and doing, and it can give us something that we can look back and laugh on together. So do the next right thing. Laugh at the bits that you don't like. Try one or two of the things that you think might just work for you. Good luck. Enjoy.